Picking up some dust.
In the 1960s, an impossible dream came true when human beings walked on another world.
The Eagle has landed.
In all, 24 Americans went to the moon. But it took an unseen army of over 400,000 engineers and technicians to make it possible. This is the story of the men and women who built the machines that took us to the moon. Early in the Apollo program, NASA realized it would have to drastically accelerate the development of the Saturn V in order to meet the deadline of placing a man on the moon by the end of the decade.
NASA headquarters had made the proposal to skip one of the missions that von Braun had initially proposed and to go what later on became as the all-up concept.
And what that meant was that we take all the stages and we take them to Cape Kennedy, we stack them, pile them up on each other, and then we would run the test.
Well, the risk of all-up testing is that if anything failed, any part failed, we would lose the vehicle.
November 9th, 1967. Finally, after more than half a decade of technological achievement, the Saturn V was poised for its first unmanned all-up test. The flight would be known as Apollo 4.
Apollo 4 was a tense time because those of us who were working on the individual stages were not sure that if we didn't do the individual stage tests at the time, something might go wrong.
Testing to date had been successful, and so we had reason to believe that everything would work. But always there's a little something that happens you never know about.
I looked at it and I remember thinking, you know, my God, we've done this. We've gotten it built and we've got one ready to fly. It's probably got 1 million pieces in it and they all got to work at the same time.
Liquid hydrogen tank in the second stage now pressurizing. T-minus 60 seconds and counting. T-minus 60.
I was in awe of what was going on because I realized that not only was my F1 engine so important, but so many other systems went through that same sort of experience. They all had their major unknowns. They all had their teams that had to do their jobs perfectly, or that vehicle would not work.
T-minus 50 seconds and counting. We have transferred to internal power. The transfer is satisfactory.
As it comes up to ignition point, you're trying to run over in your mind all the things that you thought might need checking. Again, you know, well, I think this is okay, and yeah, it has to be. We checked it so many times.
We knew the countdown was going down. We knew what time they were supposed to launch, so we were all just transfixed on the launch pad.
15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence starts. 5, 4. We have ignition. All engines are running. We have liftoff. We have liftoff at 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. The tower has been cleared. The tower has been cleared.
You see it move off very slowly. Oh, what's wrong? It's never going to go. Come on, go, 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 go.
You want to coax it, you know, get off of there.
I say, my God, that's, you know, thousands of tons and it's moving so slow you think it's going to fall over.
Shock wave is progressing across the water, coming towards you. It's pretty impressive, you know.
I had never felt this much power and energy from that distance.
We were going like, the ground was shaking like an earthquake in California.
It was absolutely incredible. You thought that you were going to be knocked over with.
It was the dawn of a new era in spaceflight. With 5 engines guzzling 15 tons of fuel a second to generate 160 million horsepower, the 6.1 million pound Saturn rocket soared skyward.
I was, so nervous when finally the ignition was on the first stage, took off, and it fired properly, and that was wonderful. And then all I'm worried about is, what are we going to do after the first stage burns out? Is ours going to start? And so we're watching the data, and we're watching the data, and we're watching the data.
I don't think I breathed for 8.5 minutes.
We drop the interstage, which is pretty neat, and we ignite the J2 engines, and they all come up to thrust. And we say, it's working, it's working, it's working.
Phew. And that's what we thought, phew.
With the years of toil and testing behind them, it was time for the engineers to place their vehicle in the hands of the astronauts. Frank Borman, along with Bill Anders and Jim Lovell, were the crew selected for the flight of Apollo 8. For the engineers, now came the realization that human lives were at stake, and for some, it was an uncomfortable prospect.
When we got right up to the point of launching astronauts, then all the fears and worries really came into existence. You worried along the way, but you realized that no human life was at risk at that moment. But suddenly, when you're coming up to your final flight review time, you realize that there were 3 lives that were depending on whether you and your team did their work properly and understood what they were doing. And I'll never forget the one meeting that I had where Frank Borman was in the meeting with us. And I was suddenly overwhelmed by the fact that we were now committing the lives of these 3 astronauts. And so during my presentation, I may not have come over exactly overconfident. And Frank Borman picked up on that. And as we broke for lunch, he grabbed onto my shoulder going out the door of the room, and he said, "Sonny," he says, "you guys have done the best job you possibly can do. We followed the program. We understand what's going on. We know what the risks are, and we're prepared to take them. Don't sweat it. We're ready to go." And that made me feel great. That was probably the greatest moment in my life during that program. TLI was always a tense time for the entire team. And yours truly, certainly was an intense time because we were counting on that engine igniting precisely at the right time and burn precisely as long as it needed to burn to give us the precise velocities that we needed to reach the moon properly.
All right, you are go for TLI, over.
With the translunar injection burn successfully completed, the crew began the 3-day cruise to the moon. The job of the Saturn V was over. For each 2-week Apollo mission, the rocket fired for less than 15 minutes. But for those involved in building it, the journey had taken the best part of a decade, and those years would remain with them for the rest of their lives.
I'm 94 years old right now, but I still look fondly about the good old days when we worked on the Apollo Saturn program with Werner von Braun. It was one of the highlights of my career.
Some of the problems that we solved and the solutions were so elegant. It just brings tears to your eyes sometimes when you think of, that was the problem and this is how we solved it, and we solved it really well.
It was such an incredible thought that man could leave the planet and actually go to the moon that man has been looking at for thousands of years, and then you say, we're up there.